Hey there, 8th grade civics students, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to roll up our sleeves and dive straight into the U.S. Constitution to entangle two concepts that honestly sound incredibly similar but mean entirely different things: civil liberties and civil rights. As active, responsible citizens, knowing exactly where your freedoms end and your rights begin is absolutely crucial for participating in our constitutional democracy. So let's just jump right in and separate fact from fiction.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we're defining liberties and rights. Second, we'll look at civil liberties as government limits. Third, civil rights as equal treatment. Fourth, we'll talk about why enforcement actually matters. And finally, Section 5, a quick recap and a transfer question.
All right, starting us off with Section 1, defining liberties and rights, and getting to our core claim. So our core claim for this entire explainer is basically this: civil liberties are your fundamental protections from the government, while civil rights are the government's absolute guarantee that everyone is treated equally. Think of civil liberties as this giant, invisible boundary line drawn around you that the government is just not allowed to cross. They're designed to protect your individual freedom from being messed with by government officials. Now, on the flip side, civil rights are the rules demanding that when the government does act, it has to play fair. It cannot discriminate. It has to treat you equally, totally regardless of your race, your sex, or if you have a disability. So one is about limiting government power, right? And the other is about using that power to ensure fairness.
Moving right along to Section 2, civil liberties and government limits. Let's look at some evidence. The Bill of Rights perfectly illustrates our claim here. Those first 10 amendments to the Constitution, they were designed specifically to protect your personal freedoms from government interference. Back when the Constitution was drafted, the anti-federalists literally demanded these amendments because they wanted strict written limits on what the national government could do. The First Amendment protects your freedom to practice your own religion, to speak your mind, and to gather in protests. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms. The Fourth Amendment protects your physical body, your home, and your stuff from unreasonable searches and seizures. These are your civil liberties. They're essentially strict, hands-off signs directed squarely at the government. What's really fascinating here is the exact wording of the First Amendment, because it perfectly proves our claim that liberties are a hard do-not-cross line. Listen to those first 5 words. Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say Congress should, try not to make laws about this. It explicitly and completely strips the government of the power to interfere with your speech or your religion. That is the ultimate definition of a civil liberty, a solid boundary that limits government interference. Okay, let's pause for a second and actually check our understanding with a real-world scenario based on the Fourth Amendment. Let's say local police want to search your home. Well, they can't just kick the door down, right? They generally need a warrant supported by probable cause and sworn by an oath. So in this moment, are you relying on a civil liberty or a civil right? Take a quick second to think back to our definitions.
And the answer is a civil liberty. The reasoning is pretty straightforward. This requirement protects you from unreasonable government interference into your personal property. The government's power is being actively limited to protect your individual freedom.
All right, let's switch gears to Section 3, civil rights and equal treatment.
So civil rights have a totally different constitutional home base. While liberties live mostly in the Bill of Rights, the true foundation of civil rights is the 14th Amendment, which was ratified right after the Civil War in 1868. Specifically, it contains what's called the Equal Protection Clause. This clause gives all people and all groups in the United States the right to be treated equally. It demands that the government cannot discriminate against you based on characteristics like your race, your ethnicity, or your sex. Basically, if a state is going to provide public schools, it absolutely must provide them equally to everyone. No exceptions. And it's incredible to see how this builds over time, as different marginalized groups thought to have that equal protection actually apply to them in everyday society. It's really a journey of expanding the umbrella of equality. After the 14th Amendment in 1868, we see the women's rights movement culminating in the 19th Amendment in 1920, which finally secured women the right to vote. Decades later, following massive direct action and protests, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed to outlaw segregation and employment discrimination. And the push for equality didn't stop there. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act legally recognized the equal rights of people with disabilities when it comes to things like employment, transportation, and public education. These are all classic examples of civil rights, solid guarantees of equal access and equal treatment. Which brings us to Section 4, why enforcement matters. Having rules on paper is awesome, but without enforcement, they don't mean much in the real world. Following the Civil War, Congress hoped to protect freedmen by passing a trio of really powerful amendments. The 13th freed enslaved people, the 14th granted citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th guaranteed the right to vote for black men. On paper, this looked like a massive, sweeping victory for civil rights. But the reality was drastically different. The end of Reconstruction allowed white Southerners to regain control of the political and legal systems. And because the federal government completely failed to enforce these new constitutional rights, Southern states instituted openly discriminatory Jim Crow laws. They forced segregated schools, they stripped away voting rights, and they just flat out denied basic equality. So how do you actually fix a system where rights only exist on paper but not in reality? Well, African Americans and other marginalized groups had to literally force the enforcement of their rights using some very specific tools. They used lawsuits in federal courts to challenge unequal laws. They used direct action, think protests, rallies, the Montgomery bus boycott, to draw national attention to these glaring injustices. And finally, they pushed for powerful new congressional acts like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It took active, relentless civic participation to force the government to actually enforce the equal protection it had promised a whole century earlier. Time for pause check number 2. Let's see how well we grasp how these historical rights were actually applied on the ground. True or false? The 15th Amendment immediately and permanently secured voting rights for all black men in practice. Think about that gap we just discussed between a written rule and actual reality. The answer is definitely false. And understanding this reasoning is so critical for your grasp of civics. Without real-world enforcement, discriminatory state practices, like grandfather clauses, completely blocked those constitutional rights. It ultimately required the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally gave some teeth to the 15th Amendment by stopping states from denying voting rights based on race to make that right a reality. All right, let's bring it all home. Section 5, recap and transfer question. When you picture iconic symbols of American freedom, remember our core claim today. In our constitutional democracy, civil liberties and civil rights play two totally different but equally vital roles. Civil liberties, which are rooted in the Bill of Rights, limit the government's reach into your personal life. They're the shield protecting your free speech, your privacy, and your religious exercise. Civil rights, rooted in the Equal Protection Clause, demand that the government treats everyone equally, ensuring that when laws and policies are made, they do not discriminate. And I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative transfer question to really test your civic reasoning in the real world. Imagine your public school decides to ban a student club specifically because they disagree with the club's religious beliefs. If you stand up against this policy, are you defending a civil liberty, a civil right, or maybe both? Think carefully about government interference versus equal treatment. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I will see you next time.